Okay, so we have watched this short video, which has interviewed Charles Hirschman. Now, I might not necessarily agree with the way that he uses and understands the terms race and ethnicity, but that's just a normal part of life. Let's move on and we're going to be interacting with a few maps taken from Cross's book, Ethnicity in the USA. And we're going to be looking at the role that immigration, history of immigration from forced immigration as well as voluntary immigration, economic migration, refugee migration, from Africa in the terms of forced migration, voluntary economic migrants from Europe in the late 1800s and the early 20th century after the Second World War. And we're going to be looking at how this has affected the ethnic and, if you like, racial diversity of America. You remember that we've already done a bit of work looking at our own country, Thailand, and of the tremendous ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity that exists in Thailand, which many outsiders assume to be all the people, all the Thai citizens are ethnically Thai, speaking Thai as their first language. This is just not the case. So you may know more about your own country than you do the USA, but there's enormous value in comparing different cultural contexts, different political contexts. And remember that ethnicity is arguably primarily a political issue. So we're going to go through a number of maps which analyze the prevalent ancestry of different parts of America. And for those of you who know a bit about American history already, then this will be not all new to you. But this is an interesting exercise in reminding ourselves of the historical processes, the big movements that have happened since the late 1700s, 1800s or 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, the later part of the 20th century, which has led to enormous changes in the ethnic and linguistic and religious diversity of the world that we live in, which sometimes leads to a cosmopolitanism where there are accommodationist policies and maybe ethnic conflicts when certain elements are also present. But let's just have a look at this map, and we're going to be developing this map in the next few slides. But what are some initial observations that you have from this map? So let's go into full screen now so that we can see the map properly. So I want you to take the time and have a bit of a look at the colour scheme on the bottom left-hand side. Now this data is taken from the year 2000, and it is interested in the prevalent, not the only, but the prevalent ancestry in different parts of the United States of America, which is a federal, it has a federal constitution, independent states, all part of a federation. It is the United States. So what are some of your observations? Well, not in order of importance, but you will see the prevalence of people of German ancestry, particularly in rural areas, where we can assume there is a primary involvement in agriculture. The second is the spread of the Mexican or Latina community, which are green, along the Mexico border, which in the 1980s was part of Mexico before the Spanish-American War. The third big observation is the concentration of where African American populations are concentrated. Now you will see that they are primarily in the south, and specifically in the southeast, around here. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. Another observation is, and in addition to that, concentrated in the large industrial cities in the north after the mass migration of black labour to the northern cities. There are other things you could point out, for instance, the importance of English immigrants up here in the north-eastern seaboard and in parts of the I don't actually know what this state is called, to be honest. So these are just some initial observations. So let's go through this one by one. So in terms of First Nation peoples, here are the concentration in the location of Indian lands. Now you will know that after the arrival of Europeans, there were a series of what can only be described as genocidal policies against Native Americans or Indians or First Nation peoples. How we call these indigenous populations depends on our preferred exonym, which is going to be a topic we will return to again. But these are the locations of these various Indian groups, and you will see concentrations in northern Arizona and in New Mexico, in Oklahoma, and in North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Minnesota. You will see where they have been less concentrated, but they are, for a number of reasons, Indian populations were present, but in some cases forced out, disenfranchised or land, or where there was genocide. Secondly, whereabouts are Hispanic or Latino populations? And so, to reiterate, they are concentrated in the southwestern border of the United States of America on the Mexican border. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this is very simple. It was in the relatively recent past that these states in the United States joined the United States, that this was part of Mexico, Spanish-dominated before the arrival of the English and other European immigrants, most of whom were Protestants to the United States. We will also point out that there are large Latina populations in Cuba. Oh, going the wrong way. So, French ancestry and French Canadian ancestry. So the French and the English fought over different parts of North America in the 1700s, and French Canadian and French Americans of French and French Canadian ancestry are concentrated up in the northeastern seaboard bordering on Canada, but there's also an important concentration down in St. Louis, which used to be a French territory, and now we're going the right way. As you will know, one of the largest mass forced migration events in world history happened when European empires forcibly enslaved blacks, predominantly from West Africa, to work as labour in colonies which were dependent on crops, primarily sugar. And these crops were able to be grown in climates that existed in the southeast of what is now the United States, in addition to this, in the Caribbean islands. And so these are still where the largest concentrations of African Americans are found. But these populations, again, did not fall from the sky. They have a history. There is a historical paper trail, and we all know of the range of ways that people shift country and change language. And in the case of African Americans, this was through the scandal of slavery and the legacy of European racialism. In terms of the English, we see again, this is a reminder that there were English immigrants, the earliest of which, and arguably the most important of which, were up in the northern seaboard, in Boston and Massachusetts, tremendously in the first decades of the Republic, tremendously important that it was English migrants to the Americas who established the first and most important institutions. But they are by no means the most dominant, as we shall see soon. There are places in the United States where there are large, important concentrations of migrants from present-day Scotland and Ireland. This was before the partition of Ireland, and these brought their own cultural, musical, culinary and religious traditions, and these are where they are distributed. But very, very interesting for our purposes. By far the largest European ethnic group, ethno-religious group, are German-speaking migrants to the United States of America. And you will see here about where Americans of German ancestry, where they are geographically concentrated. There is a branch of the Mennonite Church, which is a Protestant denomination originally from Europe, specifically German-speaking and Dutch-speaking parts of Europe, and they are concentrated in the northeast around the Canadian border. There are many Amish communities also in Canada. There are also large Norwegian immigrants who are predominantly living in the north, having come from Northern Europe. They were very experienced in farming and living in the more inhospitable, the coldest parts of what is now the United States of America. And so Norwegians are important. Other smaller groups are mentioned. There are parts of the United States where there are large numbers of Arabs. Some of them are Christian, some of them are Muslim. Lebanese, many Lebanese migrants to the United States of America are Eastern Christians, and there are also large Muslim populations, particularly in Michigan. A lot of research has been done on these. But there are also important Asian communities in the United States, and this map shows us the prevalent Asian population in these states, and you will see the size and spread of Filipinos, where we have Asian Indians, the parts of the United States where the largest Chinese, the largest Asian population are Chinese. In Minnesota, for example, there are many Hmong who were refugees from Laos and Vietnam, having fought alongside the Americans. Many left there. There are parts of the states where the largest Asian minority are Vietnamese. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves of the reason why we are looking at these kind of details. In most parts of the world, we've talked about Thailand, and there's a lot been written on ethnic identities and racial politics in America. But wherever, in most parts of the world, it's common, and even from my own country, New Zealand, we forget our history very fast. And we assume that because we live in a time in history where globalization has had a big impact for many decades, we assume that it has always been this way, and we forget that it is only in the relatively recent history that that people from all over the world have migrated and come to become citizens and to have adopted certain common cultural practices and have chosen to use specific languages. That often it is the case that these norms have only recently happened. And this is why it's important when we are studying ethnic politics, when we are studying ethnic conflict, when we are studying the dynamics of ethnicity, that we are very attentive to the historical processes which generated the cultural and racial and linguistic mix that exists. So I hope that you've found that as interesting as I have, and we've got a few more lectures following up where we are going to be continuing to explore the dynamics of ethnic relations in more than one context. So thanks for watching.